Okay, today I am getting a chance to get to meet someone new. This is someone that Bonhoeffer introduced me to. This is the artist named Mileece, and she has got a real interesting creative avenue, a very interesting artistry that we're going to dive into a little bit. So with that, I am going to just kick it off with a quick hello. So, hello, Mileece, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you.
Why don't
How are
we
you?
I'm great. Why don't we start this off by having you explain your work because it's fascinating, but I don't even want to start because I won't do it justice. So why don't we have you talk a little bit about your work?
I'll try to do it justice myself. I think I say that because I think my work is sort of always about trying to see better and experience better. What I've come to call the biophilosphere. So I'm changing my lexicon of Earth into the biophilosphere, which means to me, well, in Latin it means the bio, life, philo, love, sphere, globe. It's about using technology to do that. And that's a very, very broad subject. And it's obviously got millions of avenues that spring forth because it basically engenders reality as we know it. So doing it justice is almost hard for me because I'm not sure where to start. But I think pertinent to this conversation is probably my work on the audio aspects of that, which engender listening to our biological audio environment, so the natural acoustic environment, as well as sonifying information that is also in the biological environment, which remains normally hidden to us or unavailable for some reason, such as we don't have the perceptive modes or that we don't even know to look for it. I kind of combine what I can tease out of those two aspects into works that I present, usually in an installation format, in order to be able to enhance the spatialization of the audio in order to create an environment, but also to enhance the ability for us to mentally perceive things by altering our exterior environment into one where we become naturally more receptive. And that actually is to create environments that seem more natural, because in natural biological environments, we are biophilic, and E.O. Wilson, coined that term to mean we have an innate affinity to nature. But I think that we can take it to say that we have an innate need and integration with nature, which is expressed when we are in those environments quite naturally. So I kind of combine those things. And that means that I end up kind of becoming a sort of environment designer, as well as a sort of, people are calling it technologists, where I'm trying to organize crystals on chips and whatnot into being refractive displays of reality through other means. Yeah, and then also obviously doing precision audio to the best of my abilities whilst I, engage in those other activities to be to render lucid those interactions through sound.
Well, that's exceptional because if nothing else, I would almost ask people to, after hearing that description, ask them to look at sort of the way that that like popular culture, magazines, newspapers, and stuff have covered you. They're sort of like, oh, she makes music with plants, right? And it's so reductive when in fact we're hearing about the what you're attempting to accomplish is so much more complex and so much more connected with sort of the organic whole, right? But to many other things as well.
Yeah, so the sort of phenomenon of the plant music fad, or whatever you want to call it, it's interesting that we're talking about it and discussing it, but the depth that you find underneath that, as I was saying, kind of aside from just how do you manifest a realistic plant music, so to speak, is also addressing what do you do to make the energy to then power the devices that you're using or I'm using to make these points and to build these environments. In the trajectory of the plant project, as I guess I call it just to myself, is the rate of expansion of it been tied to, in somewhat, the rate of the work that I've been doing in renewable energies, which deals with a lot of pushback and a lot of development on different strategies and also different technologies. And the evolution of that has its own rate of growth. Not one that I agree with. I think it's far too slow. But this to say that that it's integral to my work, which is to sort of promote ecology through technology. And thus the depth that may superficially be labeled as plant music really encompasses, again, this kind of search for what is a biophilosphere, like how with Earth were, if we look towards Earth as the life, love sphere, what would that mean? Like what would reality engender in that situation? I know that it's sort of utopist, and I'm fine with that, because I think that that's what life is. So I do these things which I really do. They are in the dark forces, there's no doubt about it. There's dark forces, and however you want to qualify whatever dark forces are, that's another discussion. But without the way that we respect or don't respect or integrate with plants, monocrops to deforestation, or the way that we exploit the earth for energy, just to say that the rate of growth, again, is tied to those influences back into the project. That's the depth of the project. It's not something that I grow on a Kickstarter campaign and then I get a nice ping pong open plan office and everyone's sort of mulling around like having a superficial max patch experience with plants. It's like I'm trying to sort of develop a new paradigm for holistic existence. And yes, that's a lot for someone to do, but I don't know what else to do. So that's kind of like how I respond to my panic and fear and like revulsion of the way that we treat the biosphere. And I don't seem to be able to get away from it. So I suffer all the consequences and all the successes.
Sure. Well, it's funny, though, that you started that portion by saying, I know it sounds utopian, but I'm buying it, right? I think it's, in a way, isn't it one of the responsibilities of artists to kind of be optimists because we're trying to make change, right? The fact that you're taking a look at this as sort of a holistic and intertwined, well, you call it the biophilosphere. Did I get that right? It's biophilosphere.
Yeah. I mean, right. I pronounced biophilosphere, but I don't know because I made the word up. So you can pronounce it however you want.
I get to call it what I want then. All right. But, in talking about it in that way, what it does is it clearly, it points to the fact that this is more than just, as you say, it's more than just like putting some sensors on some plants and seeing what kind of noise you can make squirt out. It actually is a big thing. How do you, in the environment of like making an installation or an art piece, what are the sort of like signifiers you use to draw people into your worldview?
Interaction. I think that when we do something and something happens, we enter into a state of curiosity naturally. And so I try to make realistic and lucid connections between something and something happening as a result of our instigation to try to make something happen. That makes sense. That's actually how I program. It's really funny. I don't know how to do formula, so I write out the logic, and that was like the logic of interaction right there. So yeah, I think interaction is really key. And I think if the interaction engenders awe, the curiosity that then pursues that is our own innate human desire, and that's a very powerful directive force. It makes us make decisions, and really decisions is what makes us human and powerful. I try to make environments conducive to interaction, and I try to make that interaction solid, like very representational and unified with the thing I'm trying to expose people to.
Sure. I have a bunch of questions about more details, but before we get into that, I'm curious how you get here from, how does a person come to the point of like feeling strongly about these kind of issues, but also in finding art and music combined with technology as a mechanism to try and foster change? What's your background, and how did you get where you're at today?
I think that it was my placement with my parents and the external world that I was in as I was growing up. So my parents had a recording studio very young that they had a lot of seminal bands at, and I was like vision mixing and on the mixing desk when I was 2. I just saw it everywhere. I was always involved in, studios. They also had what was back then were called music video promos. So yeah, Stevie Wonder in my living room and music videos of Queen and stuff like that was like the first 2 years of my life. And I know that I wasn't particularly conscious, although I do remember meeting Stevie Wonder because he could see me. It was very strange. I was 2 and he just put his hand straight into mine. He could see exactly where I was. I think that had an influence on me just being like, yeah, music's integral to life. But then I also grew up in very central London, and my father lived in the countryside. My parents were divorced, so I went back and forth between the countryside and the urban environment every week. It did a number on me where I was like, oh, this is standing in mud, and this is what it feels like when the wind and the birds are around and I'm riding a horse and stuff like that. And then this is what it feels like to be stuck in an apartment in Holborn looking out onto the street through the windows that I can hardly see out of because they're covered in lead petrol. So, and blowing my nose and it coming out black. And, so I had this juxtaposition of experience of the external world on top of that. And I think that, and then just being, the generation I am and the time that we're in, technology has grown. It's there in front of you. I don't know. I mean, I'm imagining, like, from a psychologist's point of view, those would be the factors that one would point to. But I don't know where the empathy I have comes from, or because I get terribly upset about these things. And I've had to teach myself how to become less sensitive because I can't function. But I regularly, if I see, like this week, there's been a lot about dolphins getting caught in fish nets, and I mean, I can't cope with it. I just break down. So I feel like I can't just do piano music or music like I'd like to, because I have this crushing weight of feeling like I can't let fellow creatures be destroyed by the hand of our ego, like our false expectations of necessities, when there are solutions to them. We don't have to live like this. And I feel like because I see that, I'm responsible for it. And it's not a very comfortable existence. So I try to not bring people into this dysfunctional, terribly sad, terribly negative response to the extremely dangerous way that we operate on the biosphere, but instead use my brain to figure out, well, people are motivated by fun and by positivity and by solutions and by inclusivity and by community. And so if I really want to address this stuff, I do have to maintain artistry within it. And so from a purely kind of strategic point of view, that's also where I think that motivation comes from, and it's very strong. So despite many, as we all have a lot of personal and environmental difficulties and obstacles and endless negative responses to a lot of things, it just makes me keep going.
Right. Well, it's interesting though that you say it that way, because I guess you are right about one thing, which is that a lot of times if your artwork or your musical work comes from a place of sadness or anger or whatever, those emotions will get communicated, but not always in a way that's going to draw in a community or draw in people into, exploring more about what you're trying to discuss. Instead, a lot of times it ends up being kind of off-putting. And so having to check that in yourself and alter the way that you do artistry, that's, on one hand, it seems like a smart and useful thing to do. On the other hand, it seems like it's got to be really hard. It has to be hard to just say, well, I'm going to put this anger I feel away, or I'm going to put this hurt that I feel, I'm just going to put it away, and I'm going to try and do something that is going to be more enjoyable for a listener.
I think what I found with this is that the theme engenders itself. So the plant project is extremely difficult. It has been difficult on just a gamut of unfathomable things, which is the same as the renewable energy stuff. So what drives me in them isn't my anger or anything. It's the nature in them, because they
right.
When I program plant music, so to speak. I hate these words, but anyway.
No,
when I program
I'm sorry about that, but it just does seem to be it's so hard, especially in a verbal only medium like a podcast. It's really hard to not have to just give words to it and live with it,
Oh no! I've had to give this word to it for 20 years, so it's no new thing. But I still just feel like, I mean, maybe it's because of what's happened today. I just feel like it's sort of, it's kind of like fluffy. But anyway, the point of what I'm saying is that after the 98% of tears, blood, sweat, panic, loss of probably years of my life through stress, there's 2% of what comes out is so incredible and magnificent and uplifting and like dimensionally transcendent that it pays for itself in the like portals of awe that it opens up. And that's where I live when those moments happen, and they're very, very energetically generous. And so, I also just feel like when one focuses on that, it also drives oneself as part of its own trajectory, for lack of not sounding a little bit esoteric. But I think that these things, and particularly now over the last few years, I've really seen across the board the coalescence of this sort of thinking and this sort of people who are developing technology and strategies and technology systems are all coming together in a very kind of a serendipitous and fortuitous way. I have not seen that. And we've all been through the ringer over it. So everyone's pretty defined about what integrity means and what we're really looking for. I'm heartened to see that. And I think that it's indicative of the fact that these projects and these processes and these realities self-generate. We are much more connected to levels of reality as a matrix than we think, so this is not just an individual pursuit.
I see, right. In terms of putting together these kinds of productions, whether it's an installation or a design of some sort, what are the tools you're used to working with? My understanding is that you do a lot of your work using Supercollider. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you get into Supercollider specifically?
Specifically, I was at Tetsu Inoue's house in Sausalito, California in 1999. And I said, I'd like to make a voice plant. And so I need to learn how to program computers. And he said, oh, well, there are two languages you could use. One of them is Max MSP, or rather MSP, and the other one is Supercollider. And I said, great, well, I guess play me two oscillators from each one. And he did. And I was like, oh, Supercollider sounds better. Okay. At the time, I was doing audio engineering, so my response was, well, the interpolation algorithm on that sine waves, a high order, so I'm going to go with that. And literally, that's how I decided to embark on Supercollider missions, which have never since stopped.
I would say probably in the history of decision making for technology, that's one of the more interesting ways to choose a technology. I mean, so often people like make decisions based on what does the code look like or what is the programming environment like. But given that the output is sort of the thing, it actually makes a lot of sense to listen and make your decision that way. Now, in terms of interacting with the natural world, you are also sort of like really into the world of sensors. What I get from the information about you I've read is that you do a lot of work with sensors, whether it's plant-mounted sensors or environmental sensors. You do a lot of sensor work, correct?
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What kind of sensors work for the different kinds of environments you work in?
Oh, it depends on the environment and what I'm trying to do. Some of them one has to make. So the plant project engenders designing circuits specifically for that. And so the sensor is more than just a sensor, it's actually a system. Whereas if I'm making, for example, like I made a sort of electronic flute. So that I decided, well, to make a flute, one needs to use one's breath. So I used a breath sensor. The other thing you do when you play a flute is use your fingers. So I then built these two gloves that then control the aspects of the synth that is modulated by the breath. And that's how I would make a decision about that. And in other things, like I've built interactive biodomes and stuff like that. So there's, in there it's capacitance sensing, so that groups of people can trigger something by doing nothing. That was one thing. So it all depends on what the environment and what the type of interaction I'm trying to engender is. But yeah, I mean, I like sensors.
Yeah, well, I'm curious so to learn a little bit more because quite frankly, working with sensors has always been a failure for me. I'll just put it out there. For some reason, when I work with sensors, either I end up doing something that's too like on the nose, too much like, clap my hands and something jumps, right?
Mm,
Or the other thing is I end up feeling like I have to manage the data so much
mm,
that it was just arbitrary that I got it from wherever I sensed it, and I wasn't actually honoring the data itself. And so I'm curious, like for yourself, what is the process you go through in terms of saying, well, I mean, it sounds like you actually developed some of the sensor technology yourself, or at least the systems in a way that you're going to find viable. But what is the process that you go through in terms of, first of all, like coming up with the sensing device, but then also working with the data in the way that honors it and hopefully moves you to one of these like blissful 2% scenarios that you're actually looking for?
mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's gotten out of my hand complicated. So moving from the hardware, obviously, you have digital and analog sensors. They give you different types of data, but I particularly work with continuous control data. So with that, you've got limitations, usually voltage range. So you have 0 to 5 volts, and then something is going to modulate, usually in a sine wave like fashion, in that voltage range. So that's one set of limitations. And then from there, different types of sensors will react differently to different things. So you really have to choose the right one for the application. And then from there, for me in Supercollider, I really concentrate on synthesis programming. So with continuous controller dynamics, I work with my friend Scott Carver, who's one of the sort of principal contributors to Supercollider today. And he and I worked through building kind of a dynamics processing for real-time inputs, where we can, through functions that we can write, or rather operations, because as I said, I don't really write functions very well, we can adjust the types of values that come in to suit the parameters. And typically there's not really much that I do, because I try to do what I call aesthetic sonification. So it's taking data and turning it into sound, but giving it the parameters that constrain it to aesthetic proportions. So in that sense, what we do is just do sort of minor operations on the dynamics of an incoming signal. Like, for example, if there's a lot of noise in a signal, I can filter out frequency, like, notch filtering, or I can do other dynamics processing on that signal to give it more of a curve and tease out the sort of modality of that movement instead of the specifics. And that might be better to use on an LFO, for example, whereas a more erratic signal might be more interesting for a delay line or some such thing like that. So there is, I think that's where there's a sort of line between functionality and aesthetics that I spend a lot of my life dealing with, really making those decisions. And they're very hard to make because everything is organic and it changes. So you set one system up and then you move it and it's different. So it's not an easy thing to do, but that's how I approach it on that level. But conceptually, I think before getting there, I think things through as much as I can. I mean, I'm in the middle of designing the interaction I'm doing the Mileece Pavilion in Barcelona this year, and of course came up with a really complicated idea. Very simple conceptually, but extremely complicated to execute. So I'm in the throes of doing that. It is not a comfortable place to be, but it is interesting. And somehow I usually get out at the other end on the skin of my teeth, as they say. But yeah, I don't anticipate it being any different this time. Just to say also that, well, I just released a chapter about this in the Oxford Handbook of Algorithmic Music, where I was talking about, and this is relevant, where form and chaos meet and how that interplay causes transcendence or beauty. And I think that sensors ask for stochastic processes, particular forms of stochastic processes. And so if you develop your system with those in mind, then you honor the data as part of the thing that you're trying to do. And I think that that's very important in terms of the flow of anything that will end up working.
How much complexity, though, also comes from the sense or the fact that the kind of interaction with the natural world that you're doing is almost by definition not really portable. I mean, so if you're doing something in Barcelona, it doesn't seem like it's really reliable to say, put something together in LA, fly it out there, and think that it's going to work at all, because the environment, the way that whatever you're sensing reacts to that environment, things as simple as humidity or the length of a day or whatever, all that stuff has to have a significant impact. And how much does that change the artwork that you end up making, or makes it so fragile that it's kind of difficult to work with?
Oh, it's a nightmare. Yeah, that's my job, and that's why I get paid, because nobody wants to do that, rightly so. That's the job aspect. It's the art stuff is very, very small. Sure. In what I do. Most of it's just sort of like problem solving, and it gets very hairy. But as I said, because I'm designing systems that embrace stochastic inputs as part of the system, I do have to redefine how they operate on site every time without fail. But the way that the system is now, with regards to the software interface, especially, which was a massive thing to be able to do GUI-based dynamics processing, is just vital because of those things. So it's a really big deal. I mean, because the framework of the system is set up that way, it allows for those nuances to freely express, and so therefore, yes, you never have the same results ever, but you have a relative form. And yeah, I guess that's exactly what I'm right about in terms of the form versus chaos equation. That equation spreads its seed across the work in many ways.
Right. Now, one of the things that you've gotten known for is this Orbs project that's like a permanent installation in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, there's one, a really preliminary one at a school here in Los Feliz, yeah.
Okay. Preliminary in what way?
In what I'm aiming to do with them has a lot of technology that is not in that one. And what that one was there to serve is to say, yes, look, we can build these environments. They're not hard to do in principle. And it's not just this imaginary idea that we could have centers for hybridized wilderness environments as part of our normal urban sort of landscape and cultural experience. So I sort of did a couple of those Orbs projects in very random places, like, the permanent one here in LA and then a pop-up one in Bhutan, in order to dispel the usual reaction to things that are outside of our normal paradigm as being impossible or too difficult or whatever. Right. So that's where it is with all of the integral future technologies needing more time to develop and also integrate. But yeah, it's like the plant project. It's a lifelong project.
I see, sure.
Beyond me, and beyond the people I know, and all that kind of stuff.
Right. One question: we talk a lot about technology, and it's really tempting to go down the path of like, tell me more about how you use Supercollider. Tell me more about the circuits you're making for other stuff. But you have keyed in on some things that very few people talk about, and one of them that I want to talk specifically about is the energy use of most technology-based or media-based arts. I mean, I would say that to a large extent, when it comes to sort of the energy footprint of the artwork that we're making or the music that we're making, we just turn a blind eye to it. We don't even want to have to talk about it because we literally aren't considering it. It seems to me like that's like considering it is sort of at the heart of a lot of the things that you do. How do you provide, I mean, one of the things you talk about is trying to have a zero impact energy footprint on these artworks you do. How can you do that? How does that happen?
Grit, tenacity. Well, I'm still trying to figure it out because I started trying to do it in a much larger scale than I am now, partly because we hadn't reached 350 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And there was a chance to reverse the global trend towards catastrophic climate chaos. But that has passed. So that strategy shifted to, which it always had been, to microgeneration, distributed microgeneration. But that's too large of a ticket. So then we moved down to powering vehicles. So one of our projects at the moment is refurbishing London taxicabs to run on ethanol fuel cells, and that will engender all sorts of integration of Internet of Things and very exciting prospects of collaboration on that front, which will all then be small Raspberry Pis and stuff like that, powered by fuel cells. And then on the end of my artwork, I'm developing what I'm calling Moon Cell, which is a fuel cell, but named after the fact that, like many technologies that we use in the renewable energy arena, it was funded to go to the moon, and a lot of that funding came from taxpayers. So it's, according to the Space Treaty in 1956, I think it was, we were supposed to be using those technologies to enhance our biospheric operations here. And so I'm basically making little tiny ones that don't need systems. In other words, they don't have to have pumps and current collectors and stuff like that. And you'd be able to literally just pour your gin and tonic at the opening into little pod, and that would make your plant sing and light up. And so that's kind of where I'm at now, from having been in boardrooms at LADWP and PG&E and Edison, whatever. That's where I'm at with it, because it's just very hard.
Sure, no doubt. So we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I'm curious what directions you go in the future, because you've already mapped out like a very aggressive like art movement for yourself, and one that you've already admitted several times is probably a full lifetime's work, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you take something that you imagine spending your whole life on and decide what to do tomorrow? How does, what do steps look like in realizable chunks?
Well, they usually start with where the money's at. So the next commissions, might be doing one in London, and then obviously the Sonar one. So I'm working on developing the systems for that as my primary focus of my day these days. I also have some music that I was writing with plants and sort of other instruments for guayaki, which is the yerba mate tea. So that's actually a composition, so I'm finishing that, which is a nature video. And then in tandem, I'm having discussions like I did earlier today with Mozilla and people like that about how we are going to integrate peer-to-peer networks and stuff like that for fuel cell operations. It's all, everything happens in parallel. And I know that people say you should focus on one thing at once, and they're right, but they're wrong, because in things like this, everything has to be done in parallel. I certainly do not have the upper hand on it, but I roll with it anyway. It's messy, it's incredible, it's disheartening, it's everything. And the day is a reflection of that. So there are periods where it's like, I don't know what I should do next. Then there's periods of like, I know exactly what I'm doing. Then there's periods like, oh my God, that's amazing. Look at that. Ooh, this whole thing opens up. And then there's periods of like, why am I doing this? And that will literally happen in one day. So that's kind of it. And I have some projects like Project Moonbus that I'm working on that's coming up that encompasses a lot of these things into one project. And so to answer it in a sort of more formal and acceptable way, the idea is to create projects that encompass practical, visionary, experiential attitudes. So Moonbus, Orbs, these are projects that encompass all of these different things that may be researched just for Barcelona or just for the upcoming UK installation, stuff like that, where they can all live together. So everything I do serves the greater project, if you like. But yeah, it's messy. I won't deny it.
Well, Mileece, this has been fascinating. I'm curious, for people who want to learn more about your work and dive in a little bit deeper, where's the best place for them to get some more information?
Here with me in my studio. Like so much of my work is just not on the internet, and we've got it hoarded on hard drives here, and we're sifting through it, and I'm getting it ready to put out there in one big massive download, because everything on the internet is really produced by other people. So unfortunately, I don't really have a very good answer for that at the moment. It's sort of like patience, and then in about 4 or 5 months, there'll probably be a lot that's on my website, which is basically nothing now. But yeah, it's just mileece.is. And yeah, and I think that if anyone wanted to join or email me, they'll end up on a mailing list, and then that will be mailed out when the website is fully loaded and ready to go.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, and in the meantime, apparently we can all just catch a Lyft ride over your place to get caught up as well. So.
Pretty much, yeah. Or come to Sonar. I mean, that'll be fun. The opening's on the 13th at the Pavilion in Sonar, if you can.
Fabulous. Well, Mileece, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. It was really great to hear about your project and to hear about what's rattling around in your head. It's fascinating and an amazing level of depth. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
All right, and with that, I will let you have the rest of your day. I'll talk to you again soon. Many thanks to Mileece for spending the time with us, telling us a little bit about what she's doing, and also kind of filling us in about some of the things that she's concerned about and some of the ways that she's actually looking to promote change. Thanks for that. Many thanks to you, the listeners, for hanging out, continuing to show up, supporting me in every way that you can. And super many thanks to the people over at Synthtopia that are just doing an incredible job keeping us all informed on electronic music stuff, but also go way out of the way to help me and to help this podcast. So thank you so much to them. Y'all have a great week, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.